Okay, so today we're here to talk about not just digital transformation, but open transformation. And there's a slight distinction there. I think, folks are pretty used to talking about transformation in a number of different ways, whether it's agile, DevOps, digital transformation, these types of things are very congruent. Red Hat has a slightly different bend on these things. We call it open transformation because at Red Hat, as an open source organization, we strongly believe that working in a collaborative, transparent, and communicative way, modeled after the open source communities that Red Hat has been born out of, is a really fundamentally different and game-changing way to approach your technology transformation. So why is Red Hat talking about this? Well, Red Hat itself is an open source organization, and it modeled itself in this way. And it's been successful, and we want to share that success with folks. One of the things that I've found in my history as a public servant in BC, working to drive technical change there, was looking at how Red Hat was successful with this model really gave me a lot of sort of aha moments in how an enterprise-sized group could work differently, could transform how they're shaped, how their processes flow, and how they approach problems so that they can be a more collaborative and a better track record on delivering. So I mentioned that I came from BC before joining Red Hat. I've been at Red Hat for about a year now. And prior to that, I was working in British Columbia on a team called the BC Developers Exchange. And that team was on a 5-year mission that began around 2014. The idea there was to take a different approach to solving government's digital problems. This had come on the heels of a lot of large-scale IT challenges that didn't deliver value. Many millions of dollars were spent, and I've got a truck backing up behind me, so sorry about that, folks. But the whole process that was really an experience in sort of pain and suffering to try to deliver things in government successfully, we knew that there had to be a better way. And those better ways involved a whole bunch of things. There wasn't a silver bullet out there to fixing this problem. So the vision that we had was over time, over 5 years, we could start to transition to have agile delivery teams. We could have a DevOps culture where automation and regular deliveries were made to production in a timely way and in a repeatable way. We had procurements and policies that were fit for agile teams so that we had guardrails and rules in place that didn't slow down the teams, but actually accelerated them. And we had open source development practices in government where collaboration and sharing of code and sharing of resources was the default position rather than an exception. It was the rule. And that collaborative and open by default started to drive standards out of the community. So to avoid an ivory tower, we had community members able to inform us on best practice, inform us on what's working, and come together and coalesce around the right way to solve the problems. Now, that's a whole bunch of words about the vision. And sometimes it was really hard to get that across to people on why we were doing this. But here's the why, and I'm sure this is something that most of you are very familiar with. The enterprise project model is tried and tested. It's served for many years, but we knew that it wasn't fit for purpose anymore. When you take a look at each one of these stages on a traditional IT delivery project, right from the planning stages all the way to production and then maintenance afterwards, every one of those phases takes quarters or sometimes years. And so what you find is, because you're not getting value until things get to production, that very last stage, that a couple of years has gone by the time you get there. So you're solving 2 to 3 year old problems. And you've made your technology solutions back in the planning and requirement stages, and that was 3 or 4 years ago. So now you're using 3 or 4 year old technology to solve 2 or 3 year old problems. And that leads to really disappointing outcomes on these projects. Because as you know, technology is moving very quickly. Coming to the table with something that's 4 or 5 years old is old news. Nobody wants to hear about it anymore. People's expectations, especially on the citizen side, are very high. They want the public sector to be able to respond in days. And I think a lot of us have learned that lesson the hard way through COVID responses. There was a lot of heroic efforts to shrink this down in order to have delivery meet the population's expectations. But those heroic efforts don't scale and they can't be sustained. So we needed a new way. We needed a new way of doing things. And that new way looked something like this. This is typically how folks would represent an agile cycle, right? So on the left, there's a delivery loop. In the middle, there's options and opportunities to pivot. And on the right, delivering. And so underpinning that, Red Hat has added through the Open Delivery Foundation, the foundational skills or foundational tools and things that you need. So this is a more interesting way to think about things as a cycle rather than just as a start to finish waterfall project. And so with this image in mind and what you sort of bring to the table, there's a whole lot of things that start to become interesting conversations based on that vision of agile, DevOps, open, and community. But again, at the end of the day, it needs to get crunchy. Like, why are we really doing this? Well, we're doing it because the waterfall project model is broken. We're doing it because multi-million dollar, multi-year deliveries are too slow and too expensive. Nobody in government really asks for agile. Nobody in government really asks for DevOps or lean or any of the auxiliary things that come along with the ride. Those are the how we get there. What government really wants is the continuous improvements of its services. And so that is the bottom line why. Why are we doing this? We're doing this to continuously improve our services. And this is the model that will help you do that. So one of the things that all of these auxiliary bits around the edges have in common when you're taking a look at UX design or delivery teams or DevOps or Agile, they all have in common a relentless customer focus. And that's how you guide your outcomes, by focusing on the customer. The problem is in the public sector, that idea of customer is very abstract. And depending on who you talk to, whether it's a shared services team in the data center or, a front end worker in, the social sector or somebody in a hospital, they're going to have a very different perception of what customer is. And so I came out of the shared service organization, and this initiative was born out of that, and a better way to deliver apps and deliver technology. So when we were talking about our customers, it really wasn't the citizens. We had to come and face the fact that even though the ministry that I came from at that time was called Citizen Services, we didn't directly talk to the citizens. But who did we talk to? We had to go and ask ourselves that question and dig deep to find the answer. We asked ourselves a question at the early days. Well, all of the things that we do gets used by the development teams. So what if we treated the development teams like customers? How would that change what we did as a shared service organization? And how would that change how we structured ourselves in order to meet that customer's expectations? And that actually became a real game changer for us to talk about how we were going to support these agile teams. One of the things we had to come to terms with, though, at that point is we didn't really have that many real agile teams in government. So we actually had to create the agile teams that we were going to serve. So in a way, we had to make our customers. So we were even one step behind on that. But the good news is ministries were ready for this change. It was met very open arms, and we were able to get early adopters who were willing to come on this journey with us and be the prototypical customers while we were creating the prototypical services for them. And what we called those services and what our products were is we call it the platforms. And so these platforms were the product of the shared services team. And the idea of these platforms was not just a technology platform in sort of the tech nuts and bolts sense. It was also about people and people platforms and process platforms. And what I mean by that, for the people platforms, we had ways to collaborate, ways to communicate, training available, mentorship, and a physical collaboration space for teams to come. That was a platform. We also had, on the process side, new forms of hiring, new job skills, ways to engage with co-ops, ways to get teams together quickly so that you could continue that agile cadence on the process side of things. And then on the technology side, there was a platform available there. And so we used a container platform on top of the government's data center so that we had an abstraction layer so the teams could self-serve their technology components. They could self-serve any of the resources they needed. And it was a frictionless, high-speed experience for them that was just like consuming public cloud, but it was in the government data center, and it was a game changer. And that brought us to a bit of a principle conversation. What we wanted to do is we wanted to set up teams for success. We needed to give them a bit of governance. We needed to give them some guardrails, but we wanted to make sure that the easy thing was the right thing to do. So rather than putting things in their way, we wanted to make sure that we got things out of their way, but that the lines in the road were straight and the guardrails were nice and high, and that the teams could just accelerate. So things like automated compliance, automated security checks, automated code scanning, automated testing, early conversations with privacy and procurement and legal very early in the development cycle, as opposed to leaving all those things until the very end, making sure that you knew what the expectations were for compliance right at the start, were ways to make it much easier for these teams to be successful. And a lot of that was able to be automated once we knew what these, compliance folks were expecting, once we knew what the security requirements were, and once we knew what the privacy folks were concerned about, we could actually automate a lot of those processes and make them even easier because they were just happening in the background automatically. Every time a new version of an app got put into dev or test, all of these things would execute, and they would get immediate feedback right away on whether the lights were green, amber, or red, and then easy was the right thing. So a lot of this comes down to, a digital transformation story, an open transformation story is largely overlapping with the DevOps transformation story. So if folks in your organization are talking about DevOps, or they're talking about digital transformation or app modernization, in my opinion, they're talking about the same thing. It's all the same thing. And really, it's not about doing anything different. It's about looking at it in a different way. There's still app development. There's still coders. There's still folks banging away on the keyboard and testing their apps. There's quality assurance, and there's ops in the back end. What you're doing is you're taking a look at it from their common points in the middle, rather than looking at how they're different and breaking them apart into silos. You're looking for ways to overlap them and encourage collaboration, encourage communication, and encourage rapid delivery. So the thing we found in BC was that rapid delivery team required, or that rapid delivery capability required a different team structure. These weren't project teams in the traditional sense, and they weren't even straightforward agile teams in the sense that you would get out of an agile textbook. What we found was we needed some new concepts introduced into government. The concept of a product owner was probably the one that was the furthest away from a traditional public servant role. And so somebody who was boots on the ground, day to day doing things with their team, but also had the authority to make go, no go decisions on the app, had the authority to make quality decisions on whether a feature was in or not, and those types of things were typically escalated to very high reaches within the public sector. And so we found that that was a real big change, was delegating a lot of that authority to the product manager was a very big change for folks. Another big change, the one I've highlighted red in here, is because we were putting together a new delivery model where features were being delivered incrementally, sometimes many times in a single sprint, there would be releases to production. And some teams even got to the point where they were making multiple production releases a day. It required a new support model. The traditional model of just giving things to an app support team that either sat in a ministry or sat in a shared service organization, that wasn't going to work anymore because those folks weren't ever engaged at the early enough stage. And so what we found was we were using the Google Site Reliability Engineer model and making those folks the custodians of the DevOps pipeline. So the tools that delivered the app, the tools that did the testing and the scanning and the deployments, those tools belong to the DevOps specialist or SRE, whatever you want to call them. And then they were engaged at the very start of the project. The other change in behavior we had to really highlight here was that tool chain and that process of deploying and developing your app and getting it into production wasn't something that was owned by somebody else. That was part of your product. And we had to train our product owners to care about that pipeline just as much as they cared about the features on their end application. Because if you let the two get separate or you let your pipeline get rusty, you're going to seriously inhibit your capability to deliver. And so the pipeline is the product was a mantra that we used to repeat to the product owners over and over again. And many of them had to learn the hard way that if they didn't have that role on their team, that was the DevOps specialist SRE role that owned that process and owned the delivery pipeline and was continuously improving that right alongside of the continuous improvement of the app, they would end up in a sad place with sad faces. And it didn't take very long, usually less than a year. And so that's a key lesson learned there from my time at BC. So when we take a step back, and I made the bold statement that whether you're talking about DevOps, digital transformation, app modernization, agile transformation, you're talking about the same thing. It's really all the same thing. What I've borrowed from the DevOps world is a set of principles that I think really speak well to that umbrella of we're trying to make things continuously better. And so really the top circle on that whole model is that holistic system thinking. I find in the app development space, it's very tempting for these teams to always try to code their way out of problems and try to solve everything by a new feature in their app. When you take a step back and you look at your system holistically, you realize that not all problems are code problems. Many of the problems that can be solved with code shouldn't be solved with code. Should we be changing a process? Should we be engaging with people or communicating differently? Is there a way that we can do this that we don't have to write code? Should be one of the first questions teams ask. No silos goes without saying. Cross-functional teams are really the way forward. This is also a very large scale change for most public sector organizations and most large enterprises too, who have spent decades segmenting people by their knowledge domains. The DBAs with the DBAs, the architects with the architects, the Linux admins with the Linux admins. When you start to blow that apart, it's very disruptive in your organization. My recommendation there is to do it slowly, right? It's not an overnight change for people. Start with a few teams, bring them together with people that are willing to work in a new way, figure out where the sharp edges are on that, and iterate on that structure. Slowly break down the silos over time. Do it with trust, over communicate, and recognize that change is hard for people. And this is a big one. Bringing down those silos is a very big change. A lot of people feel that their safety net has been removed. The other one, automation. I can't express how much you need to focus on automating, especially in the public sector where, people are scarce and the workload is very heavy, especially in a lot of the back end legacy systems where there's a lot of high touch maintenance and a lot of, antique, that we'll call them, processes and applications. There's a huge opportunity to bring in automation to free up a lot of those people to move up the stack and start to be able to do higher level tasks rather than just always sort of being the guy who does the thing. We can automate the thing and now you can be on an agile team. The bottom circle, just important, measure and message. And so having really well-formed KPIs, so key performance indicators, and KROs, so key outcomes, so that you can have folks understand where you are on the journey. Because it is a journey. None of this stuff is going to happen overnight. It takes years. But as long as you're communicating often, showing progress and showing value, people will stay on the ride and it won't lose energy over time. If it's considered kind of oh yeah, we talked about that a couple of years ago, but I don't know really where it went and I haven't heard from those folks in a while, your transformation is going to fail. It's just going to fizzle and everybody will just slide back into doing work their old way. So measure key things and message it often, over communicate. I want to also say that your life cycle of your applications is going to change dramatically because, not every app is going to be under development all the time. Not every app is going to be getting features all the time. So what happens when an agile team is done and that app goes into kind of a more support mode? And that's really where that site reliability engineer model becomes critical. And even on the other end, we say, well, okay, we're doing platforms now. It's a little different than our traditional ops. Do we still have ops teams? Yes, absolutely. But the ops teams work hand in hand with the platform teams. The platform teams work hand in hand with the dev teams, and the dev teams work hand in hand with the site reliability engineers. So there is a chain of responsibility along there, but it's a little different than the traditional one. And there isn't walls between them. There aren't firm handoffs between these teams. It's fairly fluid. And depending on the skill sets on various teams, it may even be a team by team overlap that's a little unique depending on where that team falls on the continuum. What we did in our instance is we used a consistent platform across all those teams. So by using OpenShift as our container platform and a platform services team approach, we ended up in a good place where those teams could rapidly produce high volume and high quality output that really the public service could be proud of. So I'm going to peel back a little bit on exactly what that team looked like for me. That platform services team is a little different than you would expect. And so I've got a picture of them here. There's the same roles that we talked about before. There's a DevOps specialist, SRE. There's, a UX designer. There's, a solution architect. But a couple of things that we did that were a little different was we brought in a lot of co-ops. And the reason is we wanted to make sure that we had a pipeline of new people coming into the public service to solve one of our biggest problems was a high attrition rate and a high retirement rate. So we needed people to be encouraged to work in the public service and work in these new ways. And so what we were able to do over time is we went from one of the least popular co-op assignments to one of the most popular co-op assignments because we were working in this way with open source tools and working in agile and DevOps ways that we were able to really change the cycle. Another thing that we did is that empty chair in the bottom corner, that rotating 8-week tour of duty, is we would bring folks from other ministries, other teams to have temporary assignments on the platform services team so that they understood how things worked. It didn't matter whether they came from the ops side or they came from the dev side or whether they were one of the SREs, they would bring something valuable to the table. Their skills always came and added. But we also made sure that we were able to impart on them a whole bunch of knowledge and a whole bunch of learning in a hands-on learning by doing way so that their skills were augmented with what we were doing on the platform side. And so again, that was a way for us to scale and slowly spread this knowledge across the organization. Now, that's not to say that folks weren't trying to help us. There was lots of folks trying to help us along the way, and they're the traditional, folks. These folks became the community. And so all of them were starting to lean into the conversation. So when we started with a few small teams and a few apps on our container platform and things were small, there was not a lot of engagement from the traditional side of the government. But as we started to scale out and started to get big, we found that people really started to lean into the conversation and ask how they can help. And that was a fantastic conversation. And so we made sure that the door was always open for folks on other teams and from other places in the organization, that we weren't creating an ivory tower or a special island of special people. We wanted to make sure that the room could get filled at any point in time. One of the key things that we did for that is we made sure that we always had an open door policy for our sprint reviews. And we even had an open door policy for a lot of our sprint planning. So if people wanted to join in, these meetings were open, they were transparent, and folks could come in and just be a fly on the wall. Or if they had something to say and wanted to participate, that was okay too. I'm going to skip the next couple of slides because I want to get to what the platforms look like. So the platforms are really those three things I was talking about earlier. There's the customer platforms, the business platforms, and the core IT platforms. And so again, when I say platform, I don't just mean technology bits and pieces. Now, this is a model that was produced by McKinsey & Company, and I think it really captures well the way that we structured things at the Dev Exchange. Now, this article that McKinsey wrote was really how to operate like a tech company. So kind of unwittingly, we started turning BC government into a tech company, and it really worked. It changed how things happened. What ended up happening was the Dev Exchange on the left became that mission control group, the group that was kind of pulling it all together, making sure that the canoe was getting rowed in the right direction and that everyone was paddling in the right way. On that top, we had a lab space, which was a physical space where teams could come and collaborate. It didn't matter what ministry you were coming from. It didn't matter what division you were, what consulting company you were part of. It didn't matter. You could come to this open door policy space, walk right in and collaborate with folks. We also set up regular meetups of commons and guilds. So these were focused groups of people who wanted to talk about a specific domain of knowledge. So whether it was DevOps, Agile, Scrum Master, product owner, UX design, service design. There was a monthly meeting for those people to get together and talk it out and figure out what they wanted to do. We also produced a lot of training and also an online knowledge base where folks could contribute to it and have it be a collaborative knowledge base. Now, on the business platform side, we created brand new procurement methods that were geared for these agile teams, one called Sprint with Us and one called Code with Us. The Sprint with Us was all about getting team members to augment the skills that you needed. And these were very different than the traditional RFP or qualified list of vendors. It was a much more interactive, problem-based, solution-based way to get folks on your team. The idea being that you could achieve value within a sprint. Ideally, you could get a new person on your team within a sprint. The Code with Us procurement method was based on what we were seeing on the internet with bug bounties. So because all of our code was open and all of these teams were producing open source code under the Apache 2 license in GitHub, it was very easy for us to bring on collaborators. So we could bring on collaborators that could commit code and then we could pay them. And so with this one, we would basically put out a bounty to say, we need this bit developed, and folks would develop it, and then we would pay them directly using PayPal. No RFP, no qualified list. And because we had automated testing, automated security scanning, and all of the automated pipelines, that was a safe and easy way for us to do things. I'll jump down onto the tech platform because it was fundamental. I think doing this without a solid technology platform is fraught with danger. So we leveraged OpenShift and GitHubs and Jenkins as the cornerstones of our platform. OpenShift is an open source container platform that Red Hat provided. GitHub is owned by Microsoft. And if you're unaware of GitHub, you should go to github.com and be amazed. 800 million developers can't be wrong. Jenkins is an automation tool that's very pervasive in the community and very easy for people to use, and another open source tool. And what we added on top of that was a custom security stack because we wanted to raise the game on delivery. We wanted to make sure that the security story that we were telling in the container platform was the best story in government. And so by adding a zero trust security framework onto these tools, we were able to elevate the security posture of all of those applications to be world-class secure applications. So I'll finish up with a description of what the outcomes were. Because really, over the course of 5 years, a ton was accomplished. It involved, a small cast of amazing people who were working very diligently to deliver on the Dev Exchange vision at the start. And what we found over time was we created a 700-member development community, all creating open source code. And that was over 50 teams from about 12 ministries working on our platform. What we were able to do was shrink the startup time for these teams so that they were able to deliver to production with the kit that we gave them. Typically, that kind of capability to be able to deliver to production with infrastructure and storage and all of the things you would need to provision would take about 6 months in a traditional data center model. We were able to shrink that to 10 days. And that created massive savings just in time wasted and also opportunity costs, because if you're waiting so long for things, that means that the people waiting for your solution are waiting 6 months that they don't want to wait. We created that on-premise and public cloud capability so that teams could deliver to whichever location they needed to. I've already mentioned the security. And then really what this boils down to at the end of the day, which is important for everyone, is there was some dollars and cents that were key differentiators. So what we found was the total cost of ownership of these web applications running in OpenShift and developed with these agile teams went from traditionally what was about $70,000 a year total cost of ownership for an app down to about $10,000 a year. And this was a real game changer for ministries. All of a sudden, a lot of things that the smaller ministries couldn't afford to do or had to keep pushing until next year because they didn't have budget, all of a sudden became possible because they could get a team together quickly, they could put a solution through the mill very quickly and have value show up the other end without a large price tag that was really going to impact their budget, and also with a really good day two ops story so that it wasn't a huge burden of technical debt for them ongoing down the line. So at that point, I think I've hit about my 30-minute mark.